We were too late. Sergeant William Morrison said it with such finality that Marcus Chen, the humanitarian aid CEO, actually stopped mid-sentence. They were in Marcus's crisis response center, surrounded by real-time disaster monitoring systems and rapid deployment logistics software. And the 38-year-old CEO had just spent 20 minutes explaining how modern humanitarian response can save anyone if we act fast enough. It's just a matter of speed and resources. He'd invited Sergeant Morrison, 97 years old, World War II British Army veteran, as a historical perspective on how far humanitarian aid had advanced. When Marcus asked about his rescue experience, expecting heroic liberation stories, Sergeant Morrison said, Bergen-Belsen, April 15, 1945, British 11th Armored Division. We liberated the camp, and we were too late. Marcus frowned. But you saved them. No, Morrison interrupted softly. We found them. There's a difference. When we entered Bergen-Belsen, there were 60,000 prisoners. 10,000 were already dead, corpses stacked like firewood, and the other 50,000. His voice broke. We rescued 50,000 people, gave them food, water, medical care, everything, and 9,000 of them died anyway. In the 2 weeks after liberation, because we were too late. Their bodies were too broken, starvation too advanced, typhus too widespread, and all I could do was watch them die. After we saved them, Sergeant Morrison looked at Marcus. So when you say modern aid can save anyone if we act fast enough, I remember that we acted. We gave everything we had, and 9,000 people still died. Because sometimes you're just too late. And no amount of resources changes that. In the corner, a young humanitarian aid journalist, Dr. Sarah Park, 34, crisis response specialist, had frozen. She'd never heard Sergeant Morrison's story before. But now she was listening. So was Marcus. For the first time, the limitations of rapid response were becoming real. 9,000. Marcus asked quietly. After liberation? After liberation, Morrison confirmed. In 2 weeks. 50 to 60 people every day. And I watched everyone. Bergen-Belsen, Morrison began, eyes distant, was a Nazi concentration camp. Northern Germany. Established 1943. Originally an exchange camp for prisoners to be traded. But by 1945 it was hell. Morrison looked at Sarah. The war was ending. April 1945. The Nazis were fleeing. And from other camps, Auschwitz, Dachau, they sent prisoners to Bergen-Belsen. Death marches. Thousands of people. Walking. Starving. Freezing. Most died on the way. And at the camp, Morrison continued. There was nothing. No food. No water. No medical care. Typhus epidemic. And the Nazis just left. Abandoned the camp. With 60,000 prisoners. Left them to die. Marcus leaned forward. And you went in? Morrison nodded. April 15, 1945. British 11th Armored Division. We were the first unit. We went through the gates. And we saw. Sarah asked, what did you see? Morrison closed his eyes, remembering. Bodies. Everywhere. Not buried. Not covered. Just lying there. In piles. Stacked 10 feet high in some places. Men, women, children. 10,000 corpses. Morrison opened his eyes. And the smell. I can't describe it. Death. Decay. Disease. And underneath all of it, the living. 50,000 prisoners. Most barely alive. Walking skeletons. Some crawling. Some just lying among the dead because they didn't have strength to move. And we, Morrison trembled, we weren't ready. Nobody could be ready. 10,000 corpses, photograph, document, bury. 50,000 survivors, triage, treat, feed. And we couldn't. It was too much. Marcus approached, offered water to Morrison. What did you do? Morrison took a deep breath. First day? April 15th. We buried the dead first. Because disease was spreading. Mass graves. British Army bulldozers. Pushing hundreds of bodies at once. Men, women, children. All together. No names. No markers. And the survivors watched. Morrison cried. These walking skeletons, They stood there and watched us bury their families, their friends, with bulldozers. Because we didn't have time for dignity. We had 10,000 corpses and typhus was spreading. Morrison described the worst part. Feeding the survivors. First day, Morrison said, we gave food. Military rations. Bread. Meat. Good food. And the survivors, they ate. They were starving. For weeks. Months. And we gave food. And then, Morrison's voice broke. They died. From the food. Because their bodies couldn't process it. Refeeding syndrome. Stomachs shrunken. Organs damaged. And food killed them. No one in the room was speaking. Marcus had tears in his eyes. I saw 47 people, Morrison cried, die from food. First 3 days. We gave them food. And they died. Because we were too late. Their bodies were too broken. Sarah asked, what happened next? Morrison thought. Then, we learned. Feed slowly. Small portions. Liquids. Vitamins. But it was too late for many. Morrison described the typhus epidemic. Typhus, Morrison said, louse-borne disease. Fever. Delirium. Organ failure. And at Bergen-Belsen, it was everywhere. 60,000 prisoners. Most infected. And we, Morrison trembled, had no antibiotics. Penicillin existed, but not enough. No vaccines. Just quarantine. Clean water. Hope. And we watched them die. 50, 60, 70 per day. Morrison closed his eyes. Private Mary Davis. 23 years old. Nurse. Volunteered to go to Bergen-Belsen. And she caught typhus. 3 weeks later. And I watched her. Fever. Delirium. Skin turning black. Organs failing. And on day 4, she died. And Morrison cried. I thought. We saved her. From the Nazis. And then disease killed her. While free. At Bergen-Belsen. Because we were too late. Lisa asked, how many died total? After liberation? Morrison looked up. 9,000 people. In 2 weeks. Daily reports. 52 dead today. 67 dead today. 43 dead today. For 2 weeks. 9,000 total. 9,000, Morrison repeated. We rescued them. Gave them freedom. Gave them food. Gave them medical care. And they died anyway. Because their bodies were too broken. Starvation too advanced. Typhus too widespread. Morrison trembled. And I buried everyone. In the same mass graves. With those the Nazis killed. Because they defeated the Nazis. But couldn't defeat liberation. Marcus knelt, hugged Morrison. You're a hero. 41,000 people survived. But Morrison shook his head. 9,000 died. And I think every day, if we'd acted faster, if we'd had more resources, could we have saved them? And the answer, Morrison cried, sometimes is no. Sometimes you're just too late. And no resources, no technology, nothing changes that. Because bodies are too broken. And you just watch. Sarah asked, could modern technology have helped? Morrison thought, maybe. Antibiotics, typhus treated. For fluids, dehydration treated. Nutrition specialists, refeeding syndrome prevented. But, Morrison continued, the fundamental problem doesn't change. We were too late. Months too late. The Nazis starved them for months. Made them sick. And we came on the last day. Morrison looked at Marcus. Mr. Chen, your technology is impressive. Rapid response. Drone delivery. AI triage. But remember, sometimes you're too late. And all your technology just means they die with better documentation. That's not rescue. That's just witnessing. The following month, Marcus announced a new program, Critical Window Initiative. Analysis of rescuable windows in humanitarian crises, when intervention must come before it's too late. Marcus gave a speech. Sergeant Morrison taught me 3 things, he said. First, there's a difference between rescue and finding. Second, sometimes you're too late, and no resources change that. Third, speed matters, but sometimes the window closes. And we must witness. Sergeant William Morrison passed away 3 years later, at 100 at home. Beside an old list, 9,000 names, in handwriting. The funeral was held at Bergen-Belsen Memorial. Thousands came. Marcus II, and Holocaust survivors, 15 people, in their 90s, all proud, survivors because of Morrison. A new monument was erected. Sergeant William Morrison, 1926 to 2026, Bergen-Belsen Liberator, 1945, found 60,000. Rescued 50,000. Lost 9,000. Sometimes we arrive too late, but we must always witness. Now it's your turn. This story of Sergeant William Morrison confronts us with one of the most painful truths about humanitarian response. Sometimes we're too late. Not because we didn't try hard enough. Not because we lacked resources, but because the window closes before we arrive. Bodies break beyond repair. Disease advances beyond treatment. And all we can do is witness. What does it mean to arrive too late? Morrison and the British 11th Armored Division did everything right. They arrived within hours of the Nazis fleeing. They brought food, water, medical personnel. They buried 10,000 corpses. They fed 50,000 survivors. They treated typhus. They did everything humanly possible. And 9,000 people still died in the following 2 weeks. Because months of starvation, disease, and torture had broken their bodies beyond what liberation could fix. This isn't a story about failure. It's a story about limits. About the terrible truth that sometimes intervention comes after the critical window has closed. That sometimes rescue just means documenting death slightly later. That sometimes the best we can do is witness and remember their names. Tell us in the comments below. Have you ever felt you arrived too late to help someone? How do we carry the burden of being unable to save everyone, even when we give everything we have? These questions matter in a world where humanitarian crises are becoming more frequent and more complex. And if this story moved you, hit that like button to honor Sergeant Morrison and the 9,000 who died after liberation. Subscribe to Echoes of Valor for more stories that challenge our assumptions about rescue and heroism. Share this with someone who needs to understand that sometimes the most heroic thing we can do is witness when we cannot save. Tomorrow, we have another story about the weight of arriving too late. One that will remind you that not all victories look like triumph. Some look like bearing witness to tragedy. Until then, remember Morrison's words, sometimes you're just too late. And no amount of resources changes that. Thank you for watching. Thank you for remembering. And thank you for understanding that heroism sometimes means carrying the burden of those we couldn't save. We'll see you in the next story.